They sent an army, a sea of men in steel, stretching from one horizon to the other. Under a sky bruised with the colors of a dying day, banners snapped in the wind, each a declaration of power, a promise of victory. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, their armor 1,000 points of cold light. Their faces were hard, forged by 100 campaigns, each one a testament to their strength. They were the finest army the world had ever known, a weapon honed to perfection. In their ranks, confidence was not a feeling, but a fact. They believed in the simple, brutal arithmetic of war. More soldiers, more steel, more certainty. They believed that numbers would decide everything. This was not arrogance. It was experience. For a generation, their sheer mass had crushed every rebellion, toppled every kingdom that dared to stand against them. They were an instrument of order, a walking empire. Looking upon them, one would not see men, but a force of nature, an unstoppable tide of humanity destined to wash over their final obstacle. They were the answer to a question the world had long forgotten how to ask. They were ready. The commanders stood on a hill overlooking the endless formation. Their cloaks billowed, their faces unreadable masks of authority. They did not speak of doubt. They did not consider failure. Their certainty was the bedrock upon which this entire campaign was built. Orders were given, carried by horns whose mournful calls echoed across the plains. And with a sound like the grinding of continents, the army began to move. The earth groaned under the weight of their march. Drums beat a relentless, hypnotic rhythm, the very heartbeat of war. This legion had never known defeat. They were the embodiment of their kingdom's will, a force that had redrawn maps and rewritten history. The world watched, holding its breath, but the outcome was considered a foregone conclusion. This army, this magnificent, terrible machine of conquest, was surely enough. No king, no god, no monster could stand against such a display of mortal power. The poets were already composing odes to their triumph. The historians were already carving their victory into stone. This was not a battle. It was a formality. Then the first sign. A tremor, deep and resonant, ran through the ground. It was not the familiar shudder of cavalry, nor the distant boom of siege engines. This was something different, something ancient. The ground beneath the marching legions trembled, not with violence, but with a profound and unsettling pulse. Dust, thick and red as old blood, rose in unnatural plumes, choking the air and veiling the sun. The rhythmic beat of the drums faltered as soldiers glanced at one another, their disciplined march momentarily disrupted. Ahead of the column, a stampede. Animals, deer, wolves, things that should have been natural enemies fled together. A unified wave of terror, their instincts screaming a warning that the soldiers, in their certainty, could not yet comprehend. The air grew still, the wind died, and a heavy silence began to press in on them. A handful of veterans, men who had seen all the horrors war could offer, felt a cold dread settle in their bones. Something was wrong. The world was holding its breath. The earth itself seemed to be recoiling from their advance. The march slowed. The confidence, so absolute just moments before, began to crack. They had been warned, not by prophets or seers, but by the land itself. In their haste for conquest, in their unwavering belief in their own supremacy, they had ignored the signs. Beneath the very soil their boots now trampled were the ruins of a civilization far older than their own. Carved into forgotten monoliths half buried in the earth were symbols of warning, depictions of a power that slept but never died. These were not decorations. They were pleas. They were boundary markers, etched by a people who had learned a terrible lesson. This valley, this desolate stretch of land they had chosen for their final stand, was not just a battlefield. It was a prison. It was a place of sacrifice, a seal meant to contain something that defied mortal understanding. They marched over sacred ground, their iron-shod boots desecrating sigils of containment that had held for millennia. The commanders, in their strategic wisdom, saw only a geographic advantage. They saw a choke point. They did not see the lock on a cage they were about to break. This place was not chosen by them. It had been waiting for them. The awakening began not with a roar, but with a sickening crack. The very fabric of the battlefield tore open. Fissures, black and impossibly deep, raced across the plain, swallowing entire companies of men without a sound. The ground buckled and warped. The majestic rhythm of the war drums ceased, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. Every soldier, from the greenest recruit to the most hardened general, stopped. All eyes were drawn to the center of the valley, where the earth was beginning to rise. It was not an earthquake. It was an inhalation. A colossal shadow, darker than any night, moved beneath the tortured landscape. It was a shape without form, a presence so immense that it blotted out the light seeping through the cracks. The world stopped turning. The confidence, the certainty, the entire purpose of the army evaporated in an instant, replaced by a primal, unifying terror. They were no longer soldiers, they were witnesses. And then it rose. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was earth and stone and time itself given form. A primordial entity, ancient before the mountains were young, pulled itself from the planet's core. Its form was a mockery of life, a jagged silhouette of rock and shadow that towered over the valley. It did not have eyes, but it saw them. Its sheer scale was an insult to reason. The mountains that framed the battlefield were but foothills at its base. The sky itself seemed to shrink away from its presence. For the first time, the army looked small, insignificant. Their banners, once symbols of dominion, were now pitiful scraps of cloth. Their gleaming armor was nothing more than motes of dust. They were an infestation upon the skin of a god. The silence that had fallen was now a crushing weight, the silence of a tomb. The greatest army in the world had become a gathering of ants before a landslide. A single horn blast, shrill and desperate, broke the spell of terror. It was a cry of defiance, a refusal to accept annihilation. The army, acting on instinct honed over 1,000 drills, attacked. A storm of arrows, a black cloud that moments ago would have seemed apocalyptic, streaked towards the entity. They vanished against its hide like raindrops. Cannons roared, their iron shots striking the colossus with thunderous booms, only to shatter into dust. Mages, the pride of the empire, unleashed torrents of fire and lightning. The raw elements crashed against the entity in spectacular, futile explosions, leaving not even a scorch mark. It was like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. Their greatest weapons, the very tools that had carved out an empire, were less than nothing. The scale difference was absolute, a brutal lesson in cosmic irrelevance. The entity did not even seem to register the assault. It simply continued to rise, its gaze fixed upon the world it had returned to. The price for their hubris was paid in full. The entity moved, and entire divisions of men simply ceased to exist. They were not cut down or crushed. They were erased, swallowed by the collapsing ground, or swept away by shockwaves of pure force that rippled from its depths. This was not a battle. There was no strategy, no heroism, no struggle. There was only a correction, an adjustment. The land was reclaiming what was its own, and the army was an impurity to be cleansed. The entity did not act with malice or anger. It acted with the impersonal, inexorable purpose of a tectonic plate shifting. The soldiers who had marched with such certainty were now scattered, their formations shattered, their courage reduced to a desperate animal scramble for survival. But there was nowhere to run. The world itself had turned against them. Their war had ended before the first real blow was even struck. They were never meant to win. Their commanders, in their secret councils, knew this. The sages who advised the emperor knew this. The army was not a weapon sent to achieve victory. It was a sacrifice. It was a delay. A desperate, final offering thrown into the path of the inevitable. Intended to buy the rest of the world, Just a few more precious hours, a few more days of ignorance before the end. They were sent to be consumed, a buffer of flesh and bone against a power that could not be fought. Numbers, they learned in their final moments, mean nothing against purpose. An army can conquer a kingdom, but it cannot conquer fate. It cannot wage war against geology. It cannot kill a concept. Their strength was an illusion. Their purpose was a lie. They were simply the first course in the final banquet of the world. Silence. The battle is over. The battlefield is a ruin of shattered earth and gaping chasms. The red dust has settled, coating everything in a fine, bloody mist. There are no banners, no formations, no survivors. Only the colossal entity, standing alone in the quiet devastation. It stands motionless, a new mountain carved against the darkening sky. The world is different now. The age of men and their petty wars is over. The age of silence has begun. They sent an army. It wasn't enough.